Very excited to bring this to you today. It's one of my favorite topics, and it's because I think that, it is so incredibly relevant with everything that's going on in the world. And I think I'll share with you some of my ways of looking at it. So today I'm just going to be touching quickly on what's the business imperative, which I think we all know, but we have to double down on if we want to keep D&I not from coming in and out, depending on what's hot in the news, but a constant in our world. We're going to talk about outdated thinking that in fact still exists, even with all the discussions we're having today. And then, when you layer in remote work on top of diversity, how that can be a double challenge for certain people and how we have to be aware of the interplay between being remote and being diverse in a company that maybe is not as welcoming or inclusive. So when I start with diversity, I often start with a bottle of ketchup. And I took this from a Reply All. It's a podcast. They have an episode called Raising the Bar. And in there, I thought, this was probably from 2016. It really opened my eyes to how to talk about diversity with people who maybe are not used to having this kind of subject from a business perspective and not an HR perspective. So imagine that you're having a barbecue, there's tons of kids over, and you're doing hot dogs and hamburgers, and you're running to the kitchen to open your fridge and grab ketchup. And you open it up and there is no ketchup and you're having a freak out because it's a ketchup emergency. And so what are you going to see in your fridge if you don't have any ketchup? Well, you're going to see mustard, likely. And, I'm in Quebec, so you're going to see mayonnaise because, we interchange mayonnaise for ketchup. And you're going to be like, all right, well, I don't have ketchup, but I have two solutions here. I have mustard and I have mayo. All right, well, I want you to think about, for me, sitting here in the north in Canada, open ketchup is kept in the fridge. That's everybody does it. But in fact, in some of the southern US states and in the UK, open ketchup is not refrigerated. It's actually kept in the cupboard. So you're probably thinking, really? You can keep open ketchup in the cupboard? Yes, you can. So if you're in those areas and you were having your ketchup emergency, you would run to find ketchup in your cupboard. You wouldn't see mustard and mayo because they're in your fridge. You would see vinegar. So you'd be like, all right, I got vinegar. So I have a ketchup problem. I have a vinegar solution. So the interesting thing when you think about what diversity is that, businesses all face similar ketchup problems. And if you only have people who have one way of thinking or seeing the world or one way of being brought up, every ketchup problem is going to have a mustard solution. And what you really want is you want to have multiple solutions to your ketchup problem. And it's not like, oh, I could have thought of vinegar myself. No, you wouldn't have, because you wouldn't keep open ketchup in your cupboard, so you wouldn't think of vinegar. So the idea is that when we're facing really unique business problems like we are now, that we have not faced in our lifetimes, you don't want everybody having the same solutions. You really need to have as many different thinking and different ideas as possible. So what was interesting is that as I started my work early on in diversity, we really talked about the main dimension of diversity. And that would be sort of the racial, ethnic kinds of diversity when we were focusing on it. And then as I was, growing in my role, we started talking about all different kinds of diversity. There was cognitive diversity, there's background diversity, education diversity. At first I was like, oh yeah, there's more dimensions of diversity than just ethnic or racial or geography. And then it's something that started getting to me over the last couple of years, which is that I started to think, it's kind of like we're not really great on diversity. So let's invent new kinds of diversity so that we can look at people who are all the same and pretend we're different. I mean, essentially, it's like opening up your fridge and saying, yeah, we have lots of kinds of mustard, but in fact, we're all still mustard. And so I'm really thinking now, I really want to double down on the fact that we need to have a multiple ways of thinking and different ways of thinking and be a little bit cautious when we start to invent new ways of saying we're very different when in fact we're not getting the maximum benefit of diversity when you look at what the research shows. So what does the research show? I'm sure all of you know this already. It shows that non-homogeneous teams are simply smarter. That basically working with people who are different challenge you to overcome stale ways of thinking and sharpen your performance. So ideally, you want to have the more different people around the table in order to challenge your way of thinking, which actually becomes stale. There's lots of reports. I mean, everybody can dig these up. These are not new. 2015 is really when a ton of this research started to burst out on the scene. And it was McKinsey saying that ethnic and racially diverse teams were 35% more likely to have better financial returns. There was a lot of work on gender diversity, top quartile companies, 15% more likely to have better returns in the industry. Now, what's so funny is that this is 5 years ago, and that catch-up thing I showed you is from a podcast that was 4 years ago, and yet it's actually still relevant because, funnily enough, think about this. If you knew that there was like a piece of software or process you could bring in that would give you 35% better financial returns or 15% better financial returns, you would be like lining up to buy that. Like you would get a budget for that in like 2 seconds. But when we show results that say actually non-homogeneous teams outperform, and there's a business case to show you data that we shouldn't all look the same, everyone's like, I'm not sure we're ready for that right now. I'm not sure it's the right time. Maybe not this hire. And you're like, my God, you're walking away from the better business outcome. In any other situation, that would not be considered a strong leadership skill. And yet, every time I do a talk, the number one thing that pops up is, we don't have a diverse senior leadership team. And yet the evidence shows that that's actually bad for your business. And yet we just decide of all the data that we say that we look at, we're just going to ignore that data. How do I know this? Well, I've been looking at this for about 10 years now. And the Fortune 500 companies are still remarkably homogeneous. I'm going to give you some stats up here of what's in the Fortune 500. You can see that, essentially we have 10% that are non-white straight males. So we really have a lot of headway to make because this, impact of this research that's already a few years old hasn't actually translated to a lot of our organizations in a meaningful way. And my belief is it's because we're outdated thinking is being layered onto new thinking, meaning that we keep our old beliefs and then we try to bring in new beliefs. So our old beliefs around diversity are still there. And when this new data comes in, we're kind of like trying to keep both things going at the same time. So I want you to think of this in the chat right now. I want you to tell me what year you think this phone is from. Just put it in the chat. What year do you think this phone's from? Just getting some thoughts out here. What are you seeing in that? Okay, so I'm seeing like 89, that's old. 98. Okay, so a few of them are coming in right now. Yes, 96, I see 2004. So I actually worked at a mobile tech company and I know what year this phone was from. This is 2004, so whoever wrote that got that right. This is the last phone before the flip phone. Remember the flip phone? That was super cool. Most people are surprised things 2004 because they look at this and they're like, that's so old. That must have been a long time ago. But technology changes really quickly. Why do I'm asking this? Well, look at this phone here. Now, whether you have this phone or even the 12 at this point or a Samsung, I want to ask you, how many phones have you had between that Nokia static one-piece phone to this phone? Just throw in the chat. How many phones do you think you've had between those two phones? Just waiting to hear. How many do you think you've had? 12, 10, 8, 15. Okay, you must be my husband who wrote 15. You know what the answer typically is as many phones as your plan will allow you to have. Like every time it's up, you go and you get a new one. And the funny thing is we replace old technology, not when it's broken. We replace it because something new and better has come out. So essentially we have old things that we're like, it's just not quite as good as this new thing and I'm going to replace it. But Barry Schwartz had this great concept called idea technology. And that's that we don't update our thinking the way we update our technology. New ideas come out, new ways of doing business. And we're kind of like, oh no, I think I'm going to keep the old phone idea in my head. And then you have those people who have like the two phones where they're trying to hold both together. They're like trying to use both phones at the same time. The truth be told, you could plug in that Nokia and it still work, but you don't do that. But we plug in a lot of thinking from 2004. A lot of business practices and beliefs are alive and well from that date. And so, what I feel like is that it's like our business practices are like a bunch of these old phones and cables that we all have in that drawer. Like that's how we run our businesses. It's like we got all this old stuff going on, this new stuff's coming in, and we're trying to work with both systems when one of them is incredibly out of date. So one of the exchanges I love to run is called the Outdated Beliefs Exchange. So if ever I'm going to try to have anyone change what they're thinking, I do an exchange because we're a Thoughtexchange. It's anonymous, so it's really funny. And I'll ask, like, what are some outdated beliefs around diversity or around remote work that we need to let go of? What are the old cell phones from 2004 we still got going on that really we can't use our new phones with? And it's great to have people actually unpack those things and challenge them because you've got to get rid of those before you're going to have meaningful change take place in your workforce. So let's unpack some outdated beliefs around diversity. So two things are still alive and kicking right now from 2004 and beyond. And those are the concepts of merit and the concepts of fit. So go with me right now. I want you to read this statement right now. So hands up in the chat, how many people have actually heard this statement recently? Even though this statement's been going on since 2004 before, how many of you have actually still hearing this? Because I can tell you that I think it was about 10 days ago, I was in a really important meeting and this statement was said. And I tell you, my heart really just sank because this idea that, I either have to go diverse or I have to go qualified is so extremely outdated, especially with the data that says that diversity should actually make the person more qualified because you have better business outcomes. But you're still hearing like, you know what, I just don't want to lower the bar for that. And that's like the most ridiculous thing. The homogeneous team is lowering the bar right now. In Quebec, we have a saying, qui se ressemble s'assemble. What does that mean? It means those who resemble assemble. It's really hard for people to see somebody as qualified or merit when they don't have the exact same background that you have, the same way you got to that role, the same sort of trajectory of their career. So when you say, I really don't want to hire somebody less qualified, right, it's really about merit for me. Merit really is about similarity more than it's about anything else. And the world's changing so quickly. What made you qualified is no longer what somebody now would need to be qualified, given how much the world has changed. So I like to do is joke about this. So when you're talking about somebody being qualified, usually look at your past as a metric. You look at the past of maybe somebody who left the job recently, and you're likely not thinking about what's changed in the world and how that new set of qualifications need to reflect this world and not the world where you started your career in. I love it when I give career advice. This is what the world looked like when I started my HR career. I had a Subaru. That's what the royal family looked like. That's who was on the radio. That was my TV. The reason I bring that up is it's extremely outdated. So when someone says to me, what do I need to do in order to be ahead of people? And I'm giving them my trajectory, that's based on an old paradigm that doesn't exist today. What we don't do is find out what is necessary right now for what we're going to need in the future, which actually really changes qualifications. The other outdated concept is fit. So I ask you, when you hear something like, I'm not sure Louis is a fit. Like, what is somebody really saying? Put it in the chat. What are they saying when they're saying, I'm not sure so-and-so is a fit? Because really, if they weren't performing, we would just say, I'm not sure Louis is performing, we're in trouble. We say fit, we're really saying something really specific that this person just makes me uncomfortable. They're sort of rubbing up against people. They're sort of difficult. And the truth be told is if you're brought in to be a disruptive thinker, a new thinker, somebody who keeps their ketchup in the cupboard, you're likely going to say things that aren't comfortable, that are going to make people start to feel a little bit annoyed. So when everybody's wildly agreeing about something and you're the one who's like, can we go back to it's 6? I'm not actually sure whether I'm okay with that. People are like, wow, I'm so glad you're here to challenge our stale ways of thinking. They're going to be like, really, Louis, again, really? So what we do is we end up saying, let's take this offline and sort of giggle. And then we don't allow new thinking to come in. So if our version of fit is based on outdated concepts, then we're going to end up thinking that the person who doesn't have a similar industry or background, or the person who actually starts to disagree and possibly slow things down, if that's who we're deciding isn't a fit, then we should just give up on all of this, because the worst thing to do is be brought in for being different and then to be challenged constantly until you're only accepted when you start to look like everybody else. Because guess what? When you're different, you do slow things down, because when we're going fast, we're not challenging each other. So how do you engage different voices? You bring them in, and then suddenly they're intimidated by being told, let's take this offline every time they bring something up. So the example I like to talk about is 10 Bob 10. It's a story that I heard early in my career. And just to go quick, because I want to run out of time, the issue is that like Bob's the CEO, he's got an idea, he's got a couple of buddies on his team, and he's in a feedback loop that he always hears his ideas are great, but he senses there's tension, gets everybody around a table and says, I want to hear what you think about my idea. Out of 10, the first couple of people give it a 10. What's the likelihood anyone else around the room who kind of feels like they're on the B team already is going to be like, yeah, I think it's a 6. What ends up happening is there's a lot of 10 Bob 10. And I heard this story initially from somebody whose entire career ended over a situation like this. I was like, that's a terrible story. Got my first executive role. And wow, I was like, that's just what we do. We just 10 Bob 10. And then after we're like, well, that one's rough. And so how do we help people challenge that? Well, what we have to understand is that agreeing is really powerful. When we call meetings, we say we need to get aligned, we need to get on the same page, we need to get things moving. There's this sense of forward motion that the person who doesn't agree with it is actually slowing things down. That's a really big challenge for them. And that's really a big issue because the scales of knowledge and expertise have shifted. There is knowledge everywhere right now. And when I say that, I mean that, when you look at what's gone on in the world, we don't have to have the same executives talking about their ideas because they no longer have more information than the rest of us. And if you don't consult with the rest of us who are actually living the same situation right now and just as informed about what to do, we're going to push back on your old stale ways of thinking because we're no longer sort of like this captain of holding on to all information that you're bestowing on us. So here's a great example for diversity is instead of us deciding now, especially with the world looking very different in the last few months than it ever has, I shouldn't be deciding what diversity programming looks like anymore. I go out to my customers, I go out to my clientele, and I say to them, what do you think effective D&I looks like? Here's one of the top thoughts that came into that exchange, which is like, hey, remote workers now have another glass ceiling. There's a glass ceiling for remote workers and maybe for diverse people, like, wow, what's going to happen to me? And I love this other one, which is like, make sure that leaders know there's a business impact. I don't want people to think that we're tokens here. I'm here to drive business. And I really love that this exchange really shows me what it is that my team wants me to do when it comes to diversity. The other piece that I loved about it is it's like, you know, instead of me having to look and listen to a couple of loud people, it's all themed by AI. I can see all the issues that people want. People want benefits. They want to be heard. They want training. And I really can understand what the priorities are of the people who are in these situations versus me thinking I have all the information. And then finally, we even have like a downloadable PowerPoint, just comes out like that. So you don't even have to create your summary and you can share it with your executives and say, this is what people feel we need to be doing. And there's your business case, because I often hear like, what's the business case for this? The business case is that if we want to harness the talent of everyone in our organization, we have to make it possible for them to share their ideas in a safe, open, and unbiased way. And so when we layer on remote work, things get really tricky because, you know, we like to tell people, oh, remote work is great because it's all about results. But the truth is that results have a certain impact on your career to a certain level. When you get to be a director and above, it's actually your relationships and reputation that become equally and then more important. So if you're telling somebody who's in a remote situation, just don't worry, just work on your results, and you're not allowing them to interact and understand the sort of political nuances of your company, they are never going to move up. Remote work is not free of politics. So you can be an entirely remote company and your org chart might look like this on paper, but it probably feels like this to the people who work there. And the truth be told is if you don't have any chance to get any buddies or have any great, people who are going to help you guide you through the culture, how effective are you going to be? Because the truth is you can have a great idea, but if you don't know when to drop it, who to drop it with, who are the networkers and influencers, you're likely never going to have your idea heard. So when we have remote workers, it's important that you assign like a political guide, somebody who understands how things are done in your company. Who are the connectors? Who are the influencers? What are the behavior expectations? Because even though you're going to be different and come with different ideas, you have to understand how and where and how to plant them in order to have the most effective outcome. And we need to help people with that. And that's really why when we call inclusion is so important, because if you're already going to be the only person who has ketchup in the cupboard and you're remote, how are you ever going to feel like you're part of something? Think of remote leaders. So we're onboarding leaders right now remotely. We used to just say to people, don't worry, you're going to love them. They'd go for coffee with you. They would go and have chats. They'd have a company meeting. Well, it's actually much more complicated these days. So for me with new leader onboarding, and I did this for myself specifically, I run an exchange with everybody. So in fact, be really inclusive because you're remote. I don't know what people need. I'm not going to meet them in person. No one's going to get to know me from having a coffee. So I asked the whole organization I got to Thoughtexchange, what's important for me to know about our objectives so I can best support you in my new role? And everybody went in there and told me exactly what it is that they felt I should be doing. And that's so interesting because I got things like, hey, make sure you meet everybody. And you know what? There's a lot of senior leaders in this company. Don't keep your head in the clouds. This is not the kind of advice I would normally get on a remote team, call. This is really great when people feel that there's a safe place to communicate with me. I then got a summary of everything that people expected of me. And I was able to have a team meeting immediately and talk even about some tension in the room around pay. Things like this would have taken me months to get to know if I had to meet people one-on-one. But by allowing me to do a really inclusive onboarding and get everybody's voices, I was able to go, all right, so they think I need to meet everybody. There's some concerns about pay transparency. And then I did a summary and told everybody, here are the top thoughts and here are the actions I'm going to take. And that really allowed me to feel like I was getting onboarded, in a much more natural way, because remote workers often feel isolated and excluded from the company. So how impactful can you be if you're somebody, who's not in the main office, who's remote, who's leading? How effective are you going to be? How is that going to impact your career? Because just having a diverse person, but giving them no way to interact with people is not going to get any bang for the buck that we talked about in terms of those great statistics. They have to have a chance to interact and meet with people. One of the things that we also do is we send out a package to new people we hire, because we all hire remote, and we give them advice. And this is like advice they get as if they had friends. One of the ones at the bottom corner is like, our structure changes frequently. Don't freak out if you have a new boss. A lot of little tips that make people feel calm and safe, because only when you feel calm, safe, and accepted are you going to feel that you're able to share all your wonderful ideas. So we have to go out of our way to do that. And we do that with other things like donut dates. That's a feature on Slack that matches you up randomly with people for half an hour. And I probably have 2 weeks. And so I'm constantly meeting people to make sure that everybody feels like they have a connection to the people in the organization. And we do something else that's kind of crazy. It's Google Calendars. We open our calendars to everybody so that even though you're remote, you can see what's in everybody's calendar. It's shared for everyone, doesn't matter your level. It's amazing because you can go snoop. So in here, I put in 4 or 5 people. I don't just see a big thing of blue and I wonder what they do all week and why they're so busy and I'm not. I can look in there. We even have a practice that if you see a meeting and you think maybe you should contribute or you're curious, you can ask about it. So we're creating this workforce that people feel included and connected and can understand what's going on in the company. The last thing I want to say is if you're doing any kind of talent management, it's great to color code people who are remote and people who are also diverse to see if they're impacting what's going on inside this, inside the talent map. Because if somebody is remote and diverse and never in those top tier quarters, you're going to see that you have a bias against that and you need to be working towards that. And so we're going to run an exchange because I have a few minutes left and I want to be inclusive here and hear from all of you. So the exchange that we're going to run right now is basically there's 3 steps. You're going to see a QR code and there's a link in the chat. You're going to be asked a question. Just share your question. It's anonymous. Share your answer. Then star about 15 answers of everybody else who comes in, like an Amazon review, 1 or 2 if you're not into it, up to 5 stars if you love it. And then scroll down to discover and see the top thoughts and I'll answer some questions. And so I'm just throwing this up right here, right now. It's a QR code that you can do. It means you just put your phone on camera. Don't take a picture, just put on camera and you'll go right into my exchange or look at the link in the chat or worst case scenario, tejoin.com to this 9-digit code. So we're actually going to give you about 4 minutes to do this and we're going to see some of the thoughts come in. Okay, so what do we see here? Hiring diverse leaders is the key to starting a strong diversity program. Yes, definitely. If you don't have anybody in a leadership role, you're really sending a strong message. And to me, again, I think the idea that we think that only certain people fit for leaders or are qualified for leadership roles is part of that issue. Then you layer in like, well, they really need to be at the home office in order to lead a team. And you're actually going to end up with keeping your teams remarkably homogeneous past a certain level. It says business resource groups specific to each group. Yeah, again, bringing a highlight out that it's important to have different resource groups. I think that's also really important. What do we see here? The issue of D&I is nothing more than a strategy or innovation with no tangible results. Yes, I completely agree. Why is that? I think it's because it's not seen as a business imperative. My view is I'm really standing firm when I see that we're not going to make a diverse decision and we're just saying, well, it's actually not, we actually found somebody better. I'll be like, if the team isn't diverse, it isn't a better team. That this is actually not a good business decision. And it's okay to make people uncomfortable because there's a lot of data out there that supports this. And so I know often when we come as people leaders, we're like, well, I mean, we have to run a business here. We're not just here for like love and kittens and smiles. And I'll be like, this is a tough business initiative. That's what this is. And until we get comfortable, like standing our ground for that, it's always going to be put on the sideline. And if you think in the time of this pandemic, we really need new ways of thinking. I mean, every day I'm seeing a big legacy business that's going out of business that likely had all the signs that it was going down and is now accelerated. And trust me, when I look at their teams, no surprise, a lot of stale thinking, a lot of repetition, a lot of 10 above 10. Let's click on the first one. What do we see in here? Hiring diverse leaders, yes. Creating diverse workforces, more than work-life balance. Where does culture and D&I exist in a remote world? How are companies engaging with employees in a way that encourages diversity and inclusion? It's a huge challenge right now, especially. And the challenge is that you have to be really intentional about how you're going to really make it comfortable for remote people to feel like they're included. The reason I talk about Thoughtexchange or Slack or any of these other technologies is we're not intuitively inclusive. Just so you know, we're intuitively exclusive. We use jargon, we have clicks. We really like to actually keep people in separate groups. So if you're going to try to hack our evolutionary desire to keep people out and to keep only certain people in, you're actually going to need to bring in technology. people will not naturally be inclusive. Naturally, people like to get inside a small group of people who feed them the same information over again. I mean, we look at that in the media right now. So if you want to actually hear what's going on in a wide group of people, when you run an exchange, you actually can include 30 or 40 people because you don't have to book a meeting with them. You don't have to find a time everyone's there. You don't have to manage all the noise. You can just throw an exchange out and says, what are some things we should be considering as we do a strategic plan for 2021? And you can include your whole company. You can do that over an hour, 5 minutes like I did now, or 3 days. But you can actually be inclusive in your strategic planning. And that's really how you create a culture of inclusion and diversity. You actually have to do something remarkably different, because if we could have solved this already with our old Nokia phone, we would have. But we can't. Right now, we have to actually bring in new ways of thinking.